Maryanne Confoy, on that point of fiction providing your first spiritual direction, I believe this was from reading the novels of English writer C.P. Snow. This is a bit surprising. What was it about his writing that provided spiritual guidance?
It was the fact that he analysed characters and their relationships with each other in such a surgical way. It was like a laser beam going through the motivations. Now, I didn't know I was having spiritual direction. All I knew was that in reading C.P. Snow's writings, especially The Sleep of Reason, I found myself understanding myself and other people better. And also because he does a sharp analysis of power in relationships. So that would be pretty much the reason. And then later on I thought, oh, here I am, a feminist, and who was my first real spiritual director? C.P. Snow.
Well, Mary Coloe, what about you? Do you read fiction for spiritual direction or for entertainment?
Entertainment. No, for me, it's a joy, it's a pleasure. I read widely.
Can you give me an example?
Well,
what have
I've
you got
here
here on
Elizabeth
the
George,
table?
Great characters though. So that's what I get lost in. Also with murder mysteries like Elizabeth George or Jeffrey Deaver, you're thinking, you're trying to work out who did it, what's happening, and follow the clues. So the intrigue of a good mystery, as well as then a good character, good narrative. I just get lost in it. I love it, and of course it flows over because I teach a narrative approach to the scriptures, where I talk about character, reading for clues, etc., etc.
So do you quote from fiction when you teach?
Would usually say when reading or when trying to begin the Gospel of John, for example, look on it like an Agatha Christie. Read the clues, look for the clues from the very beginning, so that by the time you get to the end, you know who done it.
Does that work with the students, or do they just end up reading Agatha Christie?
I think they think, who's Agatha Christie?
Jan Gray, Tim Winton's Cloud Street. It's on your bedside table. It's been there a few times.
Yes.
We've talked about this. Why is that?
To my shame, as I told you, excuse my voice, I just can't get through it. And this is about my fourth attempt.
But you do like other Tim Wintons.
Oh, I love Tim Winton's stuff, and something just broke out with Cloud Street, a sort of a rebelliousness or something. I didn't want to follow the rest of the procedure.
So you feel bad because this is one of Australia's favourite novels.
And it's everybody's favourite, you know, and yes, so it's a bit of a limitation, yes.
Well, you have finished other works.
I have. I have been known to finish novels, yes. I'm very eclectic with my reading, and it's basically because I'm undisciplined, you know. So, you know, in the last 12 months I've tried to read Stieg Larsson like everybody else, and I just hate the violence of it. You know, everything else about it I find intriguing, but anyway, and I'm not one of those people that skips pages, you know. I wished I could learn that trick, anyway. Another person I endured was Michelle Houellebecq.
That is, yes.
Who wrote Atomised and
Platform.
Yeah. And again, it was a French friend of mine sort of put me onto him. Currently, I'm reading Coetzee's Summertime, and I'm enjoying it. So that's, you know, it's quite interesting, really. Because he's not easy. Yeah.
What is the place of fiction in your life, then?
Oh, it's relaxation. But a little bit like Mary's saying, I teach the theology of the human person, so it's character and personality and just being open to a wider world. You're always taken somewhere else, and that's why I like Flannery O'Connor, for example, too. Yeah.
Who was Catholic also.
She was Catholic, yes.
Southern states of America.
Yeah. It wasn't the Catholicness that got me about it, it was the quirkiness. I really liked her sort of edginess and that at the very southern states sort of dialogue, you know, that sort of, I've lost the word, but yeah.
Well, what is the theology of, what was it, the human
person? Oh dear. Well, I actually run 2 12-week courses on it. But it's basically about starting off with human experience and the value of human experience in any understanding beyond just the ordinary surface of life.
Mm-hmm. So. And so fiction gives you insight into
Very
that.
Much. Like Dickens and, and there's so many writers, Virginia Woolf, people just... Often I teach through... If the more interested students, I get to read some fiction, but a lot of them don't read these days.
And do all of you do that with your students? Do you give them suggestions for reading outside of what they're meant to read?
Definitely.
Mary, what do you suggest?
Just recently I've been reading this book, The Brain That Changes Itself.
So this is Norman Doidge?
Yes, fascinating book. And I actually used a little excerpt of this when I was teaching just the other week on prophets, because he dares to challenge the takeover of IT and the use of iPhone, iPad, etc., as a medium for reading. And I think it's wonderful to have somebody challenge that culture, because when I ask the students to, say, look up a passage of the scriptures, and they all get out these little texty things, and I say, I want this, I want text, I want to see pages turning over. It's a different experience.
It's a little different from the illuminated manuscripts.
Oh, very. So I say, look, read this and just see how much technology is actually affecting your ability to think, to read. So, yeah.
Maryanne Confoy.
Yeah, allied to that, and I think that really is... I think that's a really wonderful book. There's a magnificent section on imagination in it, and so that's the counter to that, and I give that out to my class, because there's such a dearth of imagination in a world where everything is so quick, and wonder can be dimmed and dumbed.
What class is this, Maryanne?
These are people who are graduate students, and again, I teach theology, and I basically teach theology to a wide variety of people.
Well, Mary Coloe, you like to reread novels as well, like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, The Bone People, Space by James Michener. What do you get out of rereading fiction? You already know the ending.
Oh, I know, and that's part of the beauty of it. Because you know the ending, you're not thinking, oh, what's going to happen next? You know that. So you can relax and you can just enjoy the character, enjoy the moment, this moment in the book and where it's at, and there's great joy for me in rereading a book like Kerry Holm, The Bone People, or Space by Michener, and Lord of the Rings, where you know the plot. So it's the moment, and being able to read it slowly, because often that first time you're hurrying to find out what's going to happen, but slow reading is lovely.
Is there anything that isn't so good to reread?
Oh, well, some books I wouldn't reread. I just think, okay, that's interesting. I don't need to reread this again. But a book I like, I'll certainly reread. And there are some I'd come back to every couple of years and reread just for the pleasure of rereading.
Maryanne, I can imagine you've reread the Australian novelist Morris West's work. You wrote his biography. Remind us first, though, of Morris West's contribution to literature.
Well, Morris West is an outstanding Australian writer, but what most people may not realise is that he started off writing radio plays, For All Those in Love and All Those Who Can Remember some of those radio plays, and then he took those into his novels when he went overseas and became a world famous Australian novelist. The reason I became involved with Morris was because I found his insight into the workings of people's beliefs and the way in which their relationships with themselves, their search for meaning, their search for a God, or their life without a God, came through in so many of his novels. The Shoes of the Fisherman is a classic one. And that's what I think was able to bring the search for faith into my classes with students who were talking about religious faith, to help them to see the human dimension of a religious creed.
What about his personal life story, which is also about his relationship with the Catholic Church? Is that also relevant?
It is, because Morris had a struggle because of his broken relationship with his first wife in a time when the church was quite punitive in its approach. And in fact, as Morris realised, he could have got an annulment, but you can't get, as some people say, it's very difficult to look for an annulment when you've got 3 children, or 2 children as he had from his first marriage. So the annulment actually he did apply for, but it was refused. So he had struggles, and he wrote books about the scandal of the church. Scandal in the Assembly is one of those. But then he wrote 3 books about popes, in which he showed the struggle with that the popes themselves have to try to operate out of freedom. Shoes of the Fisherman he said, I deliberately chose a pope who had been in a Russian concentration camp, and I thought he would know how to free people, and yet he was caught in with the pressures of the institution. As anyone who works in an institution knows, it's one thing to want to be prophetic, it's another thing to try to be in a larger institution than one person.
Well, Mary and Maryanne, you're both rereaders of fiction. Jan, I imagine you would be a rereader of the Bible also.
Yes, when you were originally asked about the Bible, I thought, I don't think about reading the Bible, because it's just part of our daily sort of exercises, I guess. And I'm not a biblical scholar, so I'm not like Mary. I tend to sort of get caught up in the problems all the time. And
but do you read the Bible for your personal searching?
Yes, I do. And that's what I mean. I sort of tend to sort of, on a regular reading, but also sort of look at specific passages to try and work out how that could be said and what we're doing now, on the whole. So
rereading the Bible, Maryanne, what about you? What do you discover by doing that?
I've got my little Bible here that I carry around with me because...
It looks like a purse. It's got a zip.
I gave it to my niece and I said to her, I want to carry it around with me, but it gets knocked around. So she's made a little case for it.
It's very practical.
Yeah, it is. And again, while I talk about faith from the point of view of novels, I also have a look at passages on faith. In the scriptures, in the letters to the Hebrews, for example, but also the struggle for faith in some of the people and the ways in which some of the novels, the struggles in the present time are mirrored in the struggles of these people under different circumstances. But wherever we are, basically, whether people are in Asia, whether they're in Africa, whether they're in Europe, we all basically have the same struggles to know who we are, how to relate to significant others, and how to grow in and through our relationships.
Well, Mary Coloe, you have a few Bibles.
Yes, I have many Bibles.
You've got a travel Bible.
This is a little travel Bible.
You brought the travel Bible, that's
small.
Appropriate.
And then I have a translation that I use in my classes, a version called the Revised Standard Version. It's a very accurate translation from the original languages. And then there's the one that I pray from, which is a more poetic in its translation, and that's the New Jerusalem Bible. So
how is it poetic? What elements are poetic?
It's not as rigorously following the syntax, say, of the original language in terms of the order of words. Its ability, well, originally it was in French, And I think French has got more symbolic, it is a romantic language, and I think the poetry, the poetic expression that comes through. So there'd be times when I'd want to quote a passage, and I know I'm quoting from the Jerusalem Bible, because it's the one I would pray from. But the text says something else, and I'm aware of that, so sometimes you get caught.
And Jan's nodding because, Jan, you can read French. So do you have a Bible that's in French?
My personal praying Bible is also the Jerusalem, and I actually sometimes indulge in reading it in the New Testament version in French, just to have the different edge. That sounds a bit posy, but it's just sometimes nice to hear it in another voice, you know. And
well, you'd go well reading Tolstoy and Dostoevsky when they
in Russian.
Well, when they use French in the text.
Yes, well, yeah,
as well.
Yeah.
Now, what I want to get to now is actually your journey into your faith, and I was curious to know how important the Bible was for you and your understanding about it. How important it was for you in terms of your decision to enter the convent. Shaking of heads.
Absolutely. I mean, when I was growing up, the Bible was Protestant. Catholics really didn't have Bibles in their home, or if we did, we only wrote in them. You know, births, marriages, deaths. We never read it. So really, the Bible had nothing at all to do with my vocation or choice as such. For me, it was the people. It was the people, the sisters who taught me, who were the greatest living book, if you like, rather than anything I read.
You grew up in the country, so you were
No. My father grew up in the country in Dargo. I grew up in the city, yes.
Well, and Mary, you wanted to study science as well, but you accidentally did classical studies when you went to university. While you were teaching, you went and did a subject in the evening. How did this become an accident?
Well, all my life, when I was at secondary school, I did the science subjects, physics, chem, pure applied maths and calculus, and I loved it. And so then I naturally enrolled in a science degree. Then when I was out teaching at Pakenham, it was free. University under Gough Whitlam was free, so there was my chance. I took myself down to Monash and enrolled, and I couldn't get a science subject after hours. So I enrolled in a subject that I thought was going to be scientific. It was going to be about dinosaurs. And it was called Classical Civilization. And it didn't have a dinosaur in it.
All sorts of dinosaurs.
It introduced me to the world of classical literature, and I fell in love with it.
And this is the Aeneid and that sort of thing?
The Aeneid, the Iliad. Out of that, that's when I did classical Greek, not knowing that later on I'd actually be doing a scripture degree, and having the Greek behind me was wonderful. So I fell into that whole area of classical literature, art, philosophy, purely following dinosaurs.
Well, you're not extinct, so that's a good thing.
No, that's good.
You didn't go down their way. Jan, what about you? Where's the Bible in that path to where you've ended up?
Well, I came from a family that did have a Bible. It was only a New Testament, but very early on I was given exposure to reading regularly the New Testament. But I guess it wasn't really the point. I can remember one key moment when it was a combination of being moved by the courageous nature of the women that were teaching me, and they were mostly sisters in those days, and the idea that there was, I'd been given a lot of love, and there was something about trying to share that in a not just in the usual ways, maybe. I don't know. I was a bit. I thought of myself as a bit special, I think, because I was the only girl, and in my family, yes. But it's interesting. I think, if anything, poetry often, because it was the deepest expression of human desire.
So, what sort of poetry?
I was just mad on all, the metaphysicals. John Donne, of course, but also Shelley and Keats.
Keats you've brought along.
I brought my Keats, which was my mother's Keats. It's really old. and it has scribbles in it from my brother, who was young then.
Did he get in trouble?
Oh, I'm sure he did. I remember that, but it was her precious book, and she would have had it as a school book, and so it's always been
Maryanne Confoy, do you need to be a romantic to become a nun?
I think you do in some ways, and when I think of the scripture and the question that you've asked, like Mary and Jan, it's very much relationships, seeing the nuns that taught me, and the impact of their lives, not only on me, but on so many people in so many different areas of life. But probably the romantic dimension for me came from the first book I really can remember reading that had an impact on me was P.C. Wren's Beau Geste, where three wonderful brothers go and join the Foreign Legion, and it's the most romantic story you can imagine. I'm not sure that I'd have the courage to read it now, but in terms of, I think it would be so saccharine perhaps, but it struck me at the time, and then that led me along the continuum of the sort of altruism of these three brothers and their heroism and giving your life for a cause. But like Mary also, I did my university studies, and I was teaching in Clifton Hill at the time, and somebody came in and asked how many children who were there were Italian. Now, 95% of the children in the class were Italian. Not one of them put their hand up. And I said to them, why, when the chap had gone, I said, why on earth didn't you say you're Italian, And I named all the Italian names, Angela Cardamone, so on. And they said, we're Australian. And I thought to myself, what have we done to these girls? And so through learning, I went to and was able to get evening classes in Italian. And I did a major in Italian, and what a gift it was to me, because one of my favourite books is The Divine Comedy. And to read Paradiso, and then if you really want a mystery story with villains, read Inferno, what Dante does to the nasty bishops and cardinals. It's fascinating reading.
Well, you can hear that my guests are enormously well read, but interestingly, the Bible wasn't the book that took them along their path, but they've surrounded their lives with books ever since as leaders in their fields and as teachers and lecturers and professors. So now do books reaffirm, though, then, your faith? What do you read to reaffirm your sense of belief? Mary?
Well, certainly, the Bible wouldn't have been something that led me into religious life. I would say it's probably the most significant book that has sustained me within religious life, in that it's certainly a book that I find speaks something of mystery, speaks to something of my soul, spirit. I find it nourishing. I find it intriguing. I find the language in the Bible, if you want to be enraged, you pick up a bit of Jonah or one of the Psalms and you can be enraged with God. If you need compassion, you might read a bit of Isaiah or again, rage with Jeremiah. So it's got all of those emotional depths that I find I can relate to. So for me, it has been an extraordinarily nourishing work. So much so, I did my doctorate on one verse, Gospel of John, make your home in me as I make mine in you. 100,000 words on one verse. That's how much I love it.
And you published your PhD as a book.
That's right, yes.
Jan, what about... So here we're talking about books that reaffirm your faith. In Australia, I guess when you were growing up, religion was much more central in people's lives. It's less so now, and on your bedside table is Tom Frame's Losing My Religion. It was actually the winner this year of the Australian Christian Book of the Year award. And so despite the title, Losing My Religion, you find it affirming. How?
Yes, I think, well, he's one of the more honest Christian writers, and he writes about Australia, I think, as a person who has deep faith, but recognises that many people don't share that faith, and yet they're valuable, they do great things, they enhance all of our society. So, what do you say? What do you say about God? What do you say about religion? What do you say about the church? So he and I would tend to agree on the fact that secularisation is not a bad thing. I think it's the working out of what it really means to be human. Instead of having some higher authority to tell you how to be, it's humans really working out what is good about being human.
And Maryanne Confoy, what about, on the table here, you've got a book by Herbert Benson, and you've also brought along a book by William Johnson. And these are books that explore spirituality, although one of them's not by a religious person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the interesting things is the way in which the shape our beliefs take religiously is impacted on by the way we see ourselves as human beings in relationship and our worldview. And Herbert Benson, who is a medical doctor and who began writing in the area of type A, type B personalities and the tendency to have or not have strokes, has written a book called Timeless Healing, The Power and Biology of Belief. And what he does is have a look at the mindset of people who need coronary care. And one other book that comes to my mind is a book I read in which it's called The Broken Heart, The Medical Consequences of Loneliness. And that's what a coronary can be, a broken heart. So that's taken me into a whole area of interest, and Norman Doidge's book is another one, but also looking at the way in which religious experience can be affected by our personality, by the circumstances of our lives. And that's why I've chosen Arise My Love, Mysticism for a New Era. One of the things I really believe is people have many more experiences that are religious, but because they don't recognise a creed, which is one of the mainstream religious creeds, they just think, oh, that was an aha experience, but they don't know what to do with it. And an Australian woman, actually through the same era that of what's his name, the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. Sorry about it, don't tell him. But in that time, this woman did a doctorate on people who had out-of-the-body experiences. And fascinatingly enough, when they had these experiences that took them out of themselves, what she discovered was that people who found that they turned into transformative experiences were the people who were able to talk about them and to be understood by them. But the people who had these experiences said the ones who were hardest to talk to were medical people and religious people. So mysticism is really a way of understanding not the way we search for God, but the way God searches for us, or love searches for us, or meaning searches for us, however we want to name that which is significantly other and takes us out of ourselves into new dimensions of living and loving. That's what mysticism is really about.
Search no further.
Lovely.
There are challenges, I guess, though. There must be challenges to this, especially when there are such scandals that rock the church, and of course that has been very recent in the news. How does that affect your belief, Mary?
It's interesting, Sarah. At the moment I'm using a book by Walter Brueggemann, The Prophetic Imagination. Now, I set it for my students to read. And I find I'm praying from it because it's taking me into that painful experience of the Jeremiah experience of feeling in exile or feeling an enormous sense of loss and grief. And that's how I do feel. I feel an enormous grief about what is happening. And so
you feel alienated from the church because of these scandals?
I wouldn't say the church.
I
I'd talk in terms of a clerical, male, hierarchical process structure. Yep. Now, when I name it like that, yes, I do. And I feel very strongly about that. Anyway, I'm on air and I do not want to entirely lose my job, but there are... I can't help, but there are ways of having then to find my place in it, and reading a prophet Jeremiah and his ability to lament and to enter into that place of grief and still find God there, I find personally sustaining, even in the midst of an enormous rage and an enormous grief.
Jan, how do you respond to that?
Well, I just feel ashamed, and it's a constant question, it's a constant challenge, how the church could regard itself as more important than the victims of the abuse. And I really don't see an answer for it at the moment, except I thank the world for challenging particularly the world media, for challenging the church on its wrong priorities. Besides the sadness of, that sort of behaviour would occur anyway under the guise of religion. I mean, that's... Yeah.
Maryanne?
Well, like Mary and Jan, the systemic sickness is something that permeates so many of the institutions of our society. It is a systemic sickness. The abuse of power, which is really intrinsic to sexual abuse, administrative abuse, and we can see that again in the greed that goes right through our public institutions. I grew up in a time when we had faith in a bank manager, where there were institutions, you had faith in a lawyer, dare I say it. But now, coming back, that's a systemic dimension, and thank heaven we are facing the code of silence, the malicious code of silence has been broken open. But personally, again, I think that's one reason why I've chosen books like The Divine Comedy, and also Narnia, the C.S. Lewis's Narnia. It was my philosophy professor who put me onto that at Melbourne Uni. And those stories are the struggle between good and evil. And that's the struggle that goes on inside me, and I think it's the struggle that goes on inside all of us, but how to name what's evil, how to name what's good in an increasingly complex ethical world. But going back into the imagination through the allegory of C.S. Lewis does enable me to come to terms a little bit more with my own conscious and unconscious struggles to find out what is the good thing to do, what's the authentic thing to do, and to grow as a human being.
Well, you all seem to have a very liberal and open attitude to your belief, where it fits with other people's beliefs, and this is reflected in your reading. Do you think you're exceptions, or do you think that that's something that you see also in your community?
I see it certainly in my community. In fact, it's the other women in my community who will push and pull me out. So I've become more involved in interfaith through sisters that I live with, or sisters who are very involved in it. And I've bought one of the books at the moment that's just a gem for me, is by Deborah Massell, a Melbourne Jewish woman, and I've had the pleasure of sitting in her classes on a Thursday as Deborah takes us through a Jewish understanding of the scriptures being used in the synagogue liturgy on the coming Sabbath. And I mean, that's just such a joy and a pleasure. And so through Deborah, I've then moved into some other reading around Jewish mystical writing. And so again, this is I don't see myself as a leader or anything or unusual. It's the sisters who I live with, who are part of my community, who put me onto. See, I was put onto The Brain That Changes Itself by somebody else, a psychotherapist in the community who said, right, read this. This is good.
And Jan, how do you find ideas for what to read?
Oh, I've never had any trouble. Everyone's always giving me books, or I do quite a bit of sort of in-service work with different religious communities of sisters, not just my own group, and there's an incredible breadth I find across the country, and a real interest, and particularly as Mary's also said, in things like, say, interfaith dialogue. Mm-hmm. My own interest in Islam came from our sisters who were working in Pakistan, running a teachers' college there, which provided a link for well, it's with Mary's University actually, the Australian Catholic University, and I started. Well, I had tried to read the Quran before, but I started reading the Quran, and then just being involved in a whole lot of smaller courses around the place, and of course meeting Islamic Australians, and who are very, not giving away their identity, but very committed to contributing to our society another worldview.
Mm. Maryanne?
Yeah, my community opens me up to more and more books. One of the things that I find sad about Kindles and those various other electronic readers is I love lending my books, and then I love people lending books to me. I'm not sure how it's going to happen with Kindles, but I'm sure people will tell us how to do that.
Yet to figure that one out.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to speak more about your book collections, because Mary, in your collection are books in German. So not only the Greek, but you've got a Mickey Mouse there in German, and you've also got The Boy in Striped Pyjamas by John Boyne. Why German?
Well, in my field of scripture, a lot of the earliest critical biblical scholarship was by Germans. And so in order nowadays to keep up with scholarship in my field, I need to be able to read in French and German. So as well as the original biblical languages, any biblical scholar would have to have French and German as well. And one way of my keeping up my skills is to read Mickey Mouse in German.
Yes, it sounds like keeping up skills. It's not entertainment at all.
No, that's not entertainment. That's keeping up skills.
Jan, now an important point. Are you meant to have large book collections as nuns?
Every time I move, it becomes a bigger problem. But well, initially, when I first started studying here in Melbourne, and my congregation's based in Adelaide, I used to take all the books back dutifully at the end of the year and put it in our congregation library. And I'd come back and notice no one else had read them. And then I was in Perth for 10 years, and I didn't have that collection, so I started building up my collection. So I shamefully own too many books.
Guilty pleasure. Maryanne, you have floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Maryanne even has a ladder that she uses to get to the books at the top, which I think is terrifying. But what does your book collection say about your life? Can you look at your books and see the different interests you've had over time?
Yeah, they're very much an accretion of all the different interests that have led me along the continuum of breaking open the understanding that I had of my discipline, you know, what theology is, and then opening it up, what psychology is, the relationship between science, medicine, psychology and religion, all of that's opened up to me. And so you can virtually see a history of my reading through the bookshelves. But one interesting thing is, one of my friends said to me, Maryanne, we'll only know you're dead when we come in one day and see all the books have fallen down on top of you. That's where we're expecting you to go, how we're expecting you to go.
And you all have feminist collections.
Absolutely,
so
yes.
Women Who Run with Wolves, that was a real classic, wasn't it? And the poet Adrienne Rich, and female saints like St. Teresa of Avila.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Tell me about her.
Oh, wow.
Briefly.
Well, right. Briefly. Well, the collected works go for 3 volumes. A wonderful woman. I mean, here she is, a contemplative sister. Quite technically, you would call her a nun because she belongs to the Carmelite congregation. But she seemed to me to spend more time on the road than inside a convent wall. She was founding other groups, reforming her own groups, advising people, looked on. She's really a woman doctor of the church. And
there aren't that many of the
accessible.
doctors of the church, are there?
Oh, no. Very, very few women make it.
And this idea of the doctors of the church is that so people have been honoured for their great scholarship. So St. Augustine, for instance, who wrote, over 300 books, is considered a doctor of the church.
Augustine, and then you've got Catherine of Siena, but there are a few women, and Teresa of Avila is one of those women.
Well, I think we have a few other doctors of the church on stage today. Now, what are you reading at the moment? What's on the bedside table?
I've got one which is so on the bedside table I forgot to bring. It's Kerry Holm, The Bone People. A New Zealand author. It's the only book she's written, unfortunately.
And so you're rereading this now?
I'm rereading
you mentioned
it.
that before.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful book. It would still move me to tears reading it. It's lovely, yeah.
Jan, what's on your bedside table?
Well, I have 2 collections. I've got one bedside table, and then I've got the one hidden, collection, which would fall over. And you've mentioned a few of the ones that are on at the moment, like Courtesy and all. But I guess one that I keep dipping back into is Philip Jones's Ochre and Rust, which is a study. It's a Wakefield Press, I think, as a little ad for South Australia. It's a study of the sort of encounters between Indigenous Australians and white Australia that are represented in various artefacts on both sides, and how there's been extraordinary sharing and adaptation on both sides. It's got some lovely stuff on Daisy Bates
who was an anthropologist.
Yes, and it's just one of those books that you can read chapter by chapter.
Maryanne?
Well, I'm reading at the moment a book by Marilyn Robinson called Home, and I got that because I read her earlier book Gilead, which is a wonderful story again of people and their life journey. But one that I really found very moving, and I finished up buying 5 copies, readings owe me, is The Secret Scripture by Sebastian Barry. It's one of the most poignant books that I've read in the past several years, so that's a key one for me.